The 40th fine arrived on a Monday morning in February, tucked inside a pale yellow envelope that smelled faintly of lavender, like a card from a grandmother, like something kind. It was not kind. It was a $150 citation for, and I want you to hear this clearly, a wind chime. A single, hand-painted ceramic wind chime my daughter made for me at a craft fair, hung on the back porch, which faced a fence, which faced a drainage easement, which faced nothing. No neighbor within visual range. No one who could have seen it, heard it, or been remotely affected by its existence. 40 fines in 11 months. 40 pale yellow envelopes. The lavender smell never changed. Her name was Sylvia Hartman. She had lived in Sycamore Creek Estates for 19 years, served on the Homeowners Association board for 14 of them, and chaired it for the last 6. She was the kind of woman who described herself as a community steward with a straight face, who brought printed agendas to neighborhood cookouts, who once had a family cited for a basketball hoop that was technically 4 inches too close to the curb, by her measurement, with her tape measure, on a Saturday afternoon when the father was at work and only the 9-year-old was home. I did not know any of this when I bought the house on Larkspur Lane. I was 52 years old, recently divorced, newly, terrifyingly free, in the way that feels less like liberation and more like standing in an open field, wondering if I remember how to walk without someone telling me which direction. I had saved for 6 years for that down payment. I had looked at 31 houses. I chose Sycamore Creek Estates because the maple trees on the entrance boulevard turned the color of fire in October, because the HOA fees were reasonable, and because the inspector said the bones were good. I did not read the CC and Rs before I closed. That is my one regret, my only one. The first fine arrived 11 days after I moved in, $14. My trash bins had been left at the curb until 4:17 in the afternoon on collection day. The cutoff, per Section 7, subsection C of the Community Standards and Compliance Guidelines, a document I had not yet received, let alone read, was 2 o'clock. I called the number on the letter. Sylvia answered on the second ring. She explained the policy the way you explain things to someone you have already decided is going to be a problem. Patient, precise, with that particular gentleness that is not gentleness at all, it is management. I apologized. I paid the $14, I moved on. And then it happened again, and again, and again. The garbage bins, the holiday wreath left up until January 9th, 1 day past the permitted removal date. The car parked in my own driveway at an angle that allegedly violated a sightline provision. The garden hose left coiled on the side yard, visible from the street, in violation of a storage ordinance I could not locate in any version of the HOA documents I had been given. Each fine was small. Each letter was polite. Each citation referenced a specific subsection, as though it had been researched carefully, not plucked from a rule book, the way you pull a weapon off a shelf. My neighbors, when I mentioned it gently, looked at their shoes. "Sylvia is just very thorough," said the woman across the street, Pamela, who said it the way you say the weather has been unusual lately. Technically true, emotionally useless. Now, if you want to see where this goes, and I promise you, you do, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell. Because around here, we do not miss a single chapter. And this one ends in a board meeting. And Sylvia does not see it coming. By fine number 20, I had started keeping a spreadsheet. Not because I was angry, though I was. Not because I knew yet what I would do with it, though I would. But because something in me, some quiet, precise, document-loving part of me that my ex-husband had spent 17 years calling uptight, recognized a pattern. Sylvia Hartman was not thorough. She was strategic. And her strategy had a target. It was me. But here is what Sylvia did not know, sitting in her immaculate house on the other side of the development, printing her pale yellow letters and sealing them with that lavender-scented glue. She had chosen, out of every person in Sycamore Creek Estates, the one woman who had spent 23 years as a compliance analyst for a regional insurance firm. I knew exactly what a paper trail was for. I had built a few of my own, and I was just getting started. Let me tell you about the spreadsheet. Column A, date of citation. Column B, alleged violation. Column C, section and subsection referenced. Column D, fine amount. Column E, whether the cited rule actually appeared in that specific language in the version of the CC and RS I had been given at closing. Column F, whether any neighboring property had committed the same or comparable infraction within the preceding 30 days to my observation. Column F was the one that kept me up at night. Because here is what 23 years in compliance teaches you before anything else. Selective enforcement is not enforcement. It is power wearing enforcement's clothing. And power, when it wears that costume long enough, starts to believe the costume is the truth. Sylvia believed the costume was the truth. I began walking the neighborhood, not conspicuously. I had always walked. It was how I kept my blood pressure down. It was what my doctor and my therapist, and frankly, the quiet voice in my own chest had been asking me to do for years. But now I walked with my phone, and I noticed things. Gerald Fitch on Elmwood Court had a boat, a full-sized fishing boat on a trailer, parked in his side yard, visible from the street every single day from April through September. I checked Section 9 of the CC and RS. No recreational vehicles, trailers, or watercraft shall be stored in visible yard areas for more than 72 consecutive hours. Gerald Fitch had received 0 fines in 11 years of boat ownership. I confirmed this later. 0. Patricia and Don Whalen on Birchwood Drive had a fence. A beautiful fence, actually. Dark, stained cedar, clearly custom. Also clearly 4 inches over the permitted height on the street-facing side. I had been fined twice for a garden hose. Their fence had stood for 3 years. Barbara Kowalski, directly behind me, whose property shared my back fence line, had a storage shed that was not listed on any permit I could find in the county records database, which is public, which took me 11 minutes to access, which I did on a Thursday evening with a glass of iced tea and a feeling I can only describe as calm fury. Unpermitted structure, 0 citations. I was being hunted. That is not hyperbole. That is the only word that is precise enough for what Sylvia Hartman was doing. And the question that kept circling me on those evening walks was the one I was almost afraid to answer. Why me? I had a theory by fine number 26. I confirmed it by fine number 31. Her daughter had wanted my house. I did not know this when I bought it. How could I have? But Sycamore Creek Estates is the kind of neighborhood where people talk, and eventually someone talks to you. And the someone, in my case, was a 71-year-old retired postal worker named Howard Greer, who lived 3 doors down and had absolutely 0 patience for what he called, quote, Sylvia's little performances. Howard told me over his back gate one Saturday that the previous owner of my house, an elderly widower named Frank Colton, who had moved to be near his grandchildren in Phoenix, had received an offer from a buyer before listing, a private offer, for significantly under market value. The buyer, through an LLC, was Sylvia Hartman's daughter, Renata. Frank Colton had declined. He listed the house publicly. I made an offer at asking price on the 2nd day. I closed in 31 days. And 11 days after I moved in, a pale yellow envelope arrived smelling of lavender. I sat with that for a long time, the specific smallness of it, that a grown woman, a community steward, had looked at me, a 52-year-old divorcee carrying boxes into her first home alone, and decided, before I had even hung a picture on the wall, that I was a problem to be managed out. I thought about the 17 years of my marriage, about what it does to a person to be managed, to be cataloged and cited and gently, persistently told that you are slightly, technically, always in violation of something. My ex-husband had never raised his voice. He had been very thorough, too. Fine number 32 was for a potted plant on my front step. Not a dead plant, not an overgrown plant, a healthy, flowering begonia in a terracotta pot, 6 inches to the left of my front door, which Sylvia had measured and documented with a photograph as being in violation of the entryway obstruction policy. She took a photograph of my begonia. I added it to column F. And then I did something I had been building toward for months without fully realizing it. I called the county clerk's office. I asked a simple question, a very boring, procedural, utterly unremarkable question. I asked how one files to run for a seat on a homeowners association board. The woman on the phone told me there was an election in 6 weeks. 2 seats were open. Filing deadline was in 8 days. And that phone call on a Wednesday afternoon in October is where this story actually begins. I want to tell you something before we go any further. What I am about to describe is not the part where everything goes smoothly. It is not the part where the protagonist files her paperwork, wins the election, and justice arrives on a silver tray. I need you to understand that, because what actually happened was messier and stranger and ultimately more satisfying than anything clean could have been. But first, I need to show you something you need to see. While I was filling out my candidate filing form at my kitchen table on a Thursday evening, while I was carefully printing my name, Margaret Elise Donahue, in the boxes provided, Sylvia Hartman was 3 streets away, on the phone with the 2 other sitting board members. Their names were Richard Caswell and Deb Okafor. Richard had been on the board for 9 years, Deb for 4. Both of them, I would later learn, had been recipients of Sylvia's particular brand of management, not as targets, but as beneficiaries. Their violations overlooked, their variance requests approved without the standard 60-day review, their loyalty, quiet and cultivated, maintained through the specific warmth Sylvia reserved for people who did not challenge her. On that Thursday evening, Sylvia told them someone new was filing. She did not say my name. She said, "The woman on Larkspur," which is how she always referred to me, I would eventually discover. Not Margaret, not my neighbor, the woman on Larkspur, as though naming me would make me more real than she wanted me to be. She told Richard and Deb that she had spoken to the HOA's attorney, a man named Jeffrey Pruitt, who billed at $310 an hour, and had drafted 17 cease and desist letters at Sylvia's request over the past 6 years, none of which I knew about yet. And that there were grounds to challenge a candidacy if the candidate had outstanding unpaid fines. I had outstanding unpaid fines. Not because I couldn't pay them. I could. I had been paying every single one dutifully within the 10-day window, logging the payment confirmation numbers in column G of my spreadsheet. Every one except the last 3, fines 38, 39, and 40, which I had placed in formal written dispute per Section 14 of the CC&Rs, pending documentation of the cited violations. A dispute, per the same Section 14, suspended the payment obligation during review. I was legally current. I had followed the process exactly. Sylvia's attorney did not mention Section 14. I have to stop here for just a second, because if you are watching this and something about it is sitting in your chest, that specific, suffocating feeling of doing everything right and still being told you are wrong, drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you have ever been in a room where the rules only applied to you. I read every single one. Okay, now, where were we? Right, the attorney. Jeffrey Pruitt sent a letter to the HOA's election committee, which consisted of Sylvia and Richard, Deb having recused herself from anything involving candidate review after her cousin had run unsuccessfully 3 years prior, stating that Margaret Elise Donahue of Larkspur Lane had unresolved financial obligations to the association and was therefore ineligible to appear on the ballot. The letter arrived at my door on a Saturday morning, certified mail, no lavender this time. I read it twice. I set it down. I picked it up and read it a third time. And something happened in me that I do not have a clean word for. It was not rage exactly. Rage is hot. This was cold. This was the feeling of watching someone show you exactly who they are, in writing, with their name signed at the bottom, and realizing they have just handed you the most useful document you have ever received. Thank you, Jeffrey. I called Howard Greer. Howard had, over the preceding weeks, become something between a neighbor and an intelligence asset. He knew everything about Sycamore Creek Estates, its history, its grievances, its quiet factions. He also, as it turned out, had kept every HOA meeting minute from the last 11 years in a series of manila folders organized by quarter. Howard had been waiting for someone like me for a very long time. He told me something that Saturday afternoon, standing in his garage surrounded by his folders, that I had not known and could not have anticipated. Deb Okafor had her own spreadsheet, not column A through G, not a compliance document, something rawer than that, a personal record kept on her phone's notes app of every time Sylvia had pressured her to approve something she was uncomfortable with. Every time Jeffrey Pruitt had been called in to do something that felt to Deb like it was slightly, technically, possibly not what the HOA documents actually permitted. Deb had been waiting too. She just hadn't known there was anyone worth waiting for. Here is what neither of them knew yet. Not Howard, not Deb, not Sylvia. As that Saturday folded into evening, and I sat at my kitchen table with Jeffrey Pruitt's letter and my 11 months of spreadsheets and Howard's 11 years of meeting minutes. I had found something in those minutes, something small, something that had probably seemed, at the time, like a minor procedural footnote, something that meant the last 4 years of Sylvia Hartman's board tenure were not, technically, legally valid. Not one day of IT. And I had not said a word. Let me take you back to Howard's garage, to the manila folders. There were 44 of them. 11 years of quarterly meeting minutes, printed and hole-punched, and organized with the particular devotion of a man who had once, he told me, filed a formal grievance about a stop sign that the county had placed 6 inches outside its permitted easement. Howard Greer did not let things go. Howard Greer was, in the best possible way, my people. The HOA bylaws for Sycamore Creek Estates required that board elections be held annually in October, with results certified by a neutral third-party election monitor. A provision added in 2014 after a disputed vote that Howard described as the Great Gazebo Incident, which I did not have time to fully unpack, but which apparently involved a structural engineer, 2 lawyers, and a woman named Constance, who had since moved to Scottsdale. The neutral third-party monitor. That was the provision. That was the footnote. In October of 4 years ago, when Sylvia had run unopposed for her 4th consecutive term as board chair, the minutes recorded the election results as certified by, and I am reading this directly, Richard Caswell, board member, acting in the capacity of election observer per temporary procedural accommodation. Richard Caswell, a sitting board member, certifying the election of the board chair he served under. There was no record of a vote to authorize the temporary procedural accommodation. There was no record of the accommodation being disclosed to the community. There was no record of any resident being notified that the standard election monitor had not been retained. There was only Richard's signature and Sylvia's name, and the minutes moving briskly on to the budget review. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with it the way you sit with something you are not yet ready to use, the way you hold a door open and wait to see who else needs to walk through it before you let it close. Because here's the thing about procedural invalidity in a governing document context, and I want to be precise here because the precision matters. An improperly certified election does not automatically dissolve a board. It does not immediately void 4 years of decisions. What it does, what it creates, is the standing to challenge, the standing to petition, the standing to call a special meeting under Section 11 of the CC&RS, requiring the presence of no fewer than 20% of the community's homeowners to demand a formal review. Sycamore Creek Estates had 112 households. 20% was 23 signatures. I had already spoken to Howard. I had already spoken to Deb. And I had 40 neighbors who had received citations they considered unjust, whose names and contact information were, because Howard had kept everything, right there in the grievance log that the HOA was required by its own bylaws to maintain, and that Sylvia had apparently never considered anyone would actually read. I want to stop here, because this is the part of the story I did not expect to feel the way it felt. I had spent 11 months being made small. 11 months of pale yellow envelopes and lavender, and the specific humiliation of being treated like a problem in a place that was supposed to be your home. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, somewhere between fine number 14 and fine number 31, I had started to believe it. Not consciously, not in a way I would have admitted to anyone, but in the way that sustained, low-grade injustice works on a person. Quietly, in the margins, in the moment you hesitate before hanging something on your own wall, because you find yourself wondering if it's too visible from the street. I had been afraid, in my own house, that I had saved for 6 years to buy. Afraid of a woman I had never once had a real conversation with. I have to step out of Margaret's story for just a moment, because this part, the part where you start editing yourself in your own space, that is the part nobody talks about. We talk about the fines, we talk about the villain, we talk about the revenge eventually, but we do not talk enough about what happens in between. That slow, almost invisible process of making yourself smaller so that the person making your life difficult has less surface area to hit. I think a lot of you know what that is. And I do not mean just in an HOA. I mean in a marriage, in a family, in a workplace where someone decided before you walked in the door that you were a problem to be contained. The thing that strikes me about Margaret, the thing I keep coming back to, is that she did not get angry first. She got organized. And I think that is because she had learned, somewhere along the way, that anger without evidence is just noise. And she was done making noise. She wanted to make history. Let's go back in. Margaret Donahue spent 3 weeks making 11 phone calls a day. Not angry calls, not accusatory calls. She introduced herself. She mentioned Howard's name as a reference, because Howard was beloved in ways that Sylvia had never bothered to understand, and she asked one simple question. Had the person she was speaking to ever received a citation they felt was unfair? The answer, in 37 out of 40 attempts, was yes. She did not ask them to do anything yet. She simply listened. She validated. She said, "I hear you, and I want you to know you are not imagining it." And then she said she was looking into some things and would be back in touch. By the time she called back, she had a petition, 2 pages, formal language, citing Section 11, requesting a special community meeting to review the procedural validity of the board certification process in the election of 4 years prior. She also had, attached as Exhibit A, a comparative citation analysis across 41 properties over 11 months, demonstrating a statistically significant pattern of enforcement concentrated on a single address. That address was hers. Exhibit B was Jeffrey Pruitt's letter, the one attempting to block her candidacy by misrepresenting her dispute-protected fines as delinquent obligations. Exhibit C was a letter from a licensed HOA governance attorney, not Jeffrey Pruitt, whom Margaret had retained for a flat fee of $800, which she considered the finest $800 she had ever spent, stating clearly that the disputed fines were procedurally current, that her candidacy could not be lawfully blocked, and that the election committee's attempt to do so may itself constitute a violation of the association's own governing documents. She slid the petition under 31 doors on a Tuesday night. She hand-delivered the remaining 6 on Wednesday morning. By Thursday, she had 29 signatures. She needed 23. The special community meeting was scheduled for the 3rd Thursday of November at 7 o'clock in the evening, in the multi-purpose room of the Sycamore Creek Estates Clubhouse, a room Margaret had never set foot in, because she had never been invited to anything, because no one had ever thought to invite the woman on Larkspur Lane anywhere except into compliance. She arrived 12 minutes early. Howard was already there, seated in the front row with his manila folders stacked beside him like a small, beautiful fortress. Deb Okafor arrived 2 minutes later. She sat next to Howard. She did not look at the board table. She looked at Margaret, and she nodded. Sylvia arrived last. She walked in at 6:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled start, in the way that people who have always controlled a room walk into a room they believe they still control. Smoothly, without hurry, with the particular confidence of someone who has never once had to wonder whether the space would accommodate them. She looked at the rows of chairs. She looked at the 41 neighbors filling them. She looked at the petition, a copy of which had been formally submitted to the board per Section 11's requirements, which meant Sylvia had read it, which meant she knew what was in it. She sat down. She opened her printed agenda. She did not look at Margaret again. Richard Caswell sat to her left. He had the expression of a man who had received several phone calls in the preceding week that he had not enjoyed. Jeffrey Pruitt sat against the far wall with a leather portfolio and the specific stillness of an attorney who has been told to observe and say nothing unless absolutely necessary. Margaret's attorney, her $800 flat fee attorney, a compact woman named Iris Delgado, who had spent 11 years specializing in HOA governance disputes, and who had agreed to attend for an additional $200, which Margaret also considered an outstanding investment, sat 2 rows back, watching. Sylvia called the meeting to order. She moved through the preliminary items with practiced efficiency, and then she reached the petition. She described it to the room as a procedural inquiry brought by a newer resident who may not yet fully understand how our community governance operates. The temperature in the room changed. It was not dramatic. There was no gasp, no outcry. It was subtler than that. The specific atmospheric shift that happens when 41 people who came prepared hear someone attempt to diminish the thing they came prepared about. Howard Greer raised his hand. Sylvia acknowledged him with the patience of someone who has managed Howard Greer for 11 years. Howard opened his top manila folder. He read, aloud, the exact language of the bylaw requiring a neutral third-party election monitor. He read it slowly. He read it the way you read something to a room when you want to make absolutely certain that every single person in that room has heard every single word. Then he read the minutes from 4 years ago. Richard Caswell's name. Acting in the capacity of election observer per temporary procedural accommodation. The silence after was the kind that has weight. Richard Caswell looked at the table. Sylvia said that the procedural accommodation had been a practical necessity given the circumstances at the time. Iris Delgado, from 2 rows back, said, pleasantly, professionally, in the tone of someone who has done this many times before, that she would be happy to discuss what circumstances were sufficient under the governing documents to authorize such an accommodation, and whether those circumstances had been properly documented and disclosed, if the board felt that would be useful. Jeffrey Pruitt looked at Iris. Iris looked at Jeffrey. Jeffrey looked at his portfolio. Sylvia called a brief recess. The recess lasted 19 minutes. Margaret used them to speak quietly with 4 neighbors she had not yet met, 2 of whom had their own stories, 1 of whom had photographs. When Sylvia returned, something had shifted in her face. Not broken. Sylvia was not the kind of woman who breaks in public, but recalibrated. The way a person looks when they have stepped into a room and counted the people in it and understood, for the first time, that the count does not favor them. She made a motion, a formal motion, seconded by Richard before Sylvia had even finished the sentence, because Richard could read a room, and Richard had decided, in those 19 minutes, that the best available outcome for Richard was to be on the right side of this before the right side became obvious to everyone. The motion was to void the contested election certification, commission an independent governance review, and schedule a full community board election within 60 days under proper third-party oversight. 14 years, 19 minutes, 1 motion. It passed unanimously. Even Sylvia voted yes. Because the only thing more dangerous to Sylvia Hartman than losing the board was being seen to fight for it in a room where she had already lost. Margaret drove home through the November dark. The maple trees on the entrance boulevard had dropped their leaves by then, the fire-colored October glory of them long gone, the branches bare and clean against the sky. She thought about the day she had first seen them, how she had chosen this place, this specific place, because of how the light came through those trees, how she had almost let someone take that from her. Almost. She made herself a cup of tea. She opened her laptop. She looked at the spreadsheet, all 7 columns of it, all 40 rows, and she sat with it for a long moment. Then she opened a new document and began typing, her candidate statement for the board election. The board election was held on a Saturday morning in January, in the same multi-purpose room, with a certified third-party monitor named Carl, who wore a lanyard and took his neutrality extremely seriously, and who Margaret found, in that moment, profoundly beautiful. There were 4 candidates for 2 open seats: Margaret Donahue of Larkspur Lane, Howard Greer of Elmwood Court, A 38-year-old landscape architect named Tobias Wren, who had moved in 8 months prior and had received his first citation, for a decorative flag, within 2 weeks of closing. And Sylvia Hartman, incumbent, seeking re-election to the board she had run for 14 years. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story where I could tell you that justice arrived the way it arrives in movies: swift, total, cinematically satisfying. And parts of it were, but parts of it were quieter than that. And the quiet parts, I think, are the ones worth staying for. Margaret won her seat. Howard won his seat. Sylvia received 11 votes out of 104 ballots cast. 11. 14 years of community stewardship. 14 years of pale yellow envelopes and lavender-scented authority. 11 votes. She accepted the result the way she accepted everything, without visible fracture, with the composed dignity of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the preceding 2 months, exactly how she intended to be seen losing. She gathered her printed materials. She thanked the room for its service. She left before the results had finished being tabulated. Margaret watched her go. She did not feel triumphant, not exactly. She felt something more complicated than that, the particular bittersweet clarity of a thing being over that should never have had to happen at all. But it had happened, and now it was done. The governance review, completed 6 weeks after the election by an independent HOA consulting firm, found 14 procedural irregularities across Sylvia's final 4-year term. None of them rose to the level of criminal conduct. Several of them, including the unauthorized use of HOA funds to retain Jeffrey Pruitt for matters that did not, strictly speaking, serve the community's interests, required formal remediation. Jeffrey Pruitt's firm was not retained for future HOA matters. Jeffrey Pruitt sent a letter. It did not smell of lavender. The 40 fines issued to Margaret Donahue of Larkspur Lane were reviewed by the new board in their first official session. 37 were found to lack sufficient documented basis under the CC and Rs as written. The corresponding fine amounts, $4,260 in total, were refunded in full, via check, mailed in a plain white envelope. Margaret framed the check before she deposited it, just for a day, just so she could look at it. She deposited it on a Tuesday. She used part of it to buy a new wind chime for the back porch, hand-painted ceramic, made by her daughter, slightly larger than the original. It faces the drainage easement. It faces nothing. It makes the most beautiful sound in a light wind. No one has said a word. The new board's first substantive action was a complete audit of the CC and Rs, a 6-month process managed by Margaret in her capacity as the newly elected compliance chair, which is a title that made Howard Greer laugh for approximately 45 seconds when it was announced. Outdated provisions were struck. Enforcement protocols were standardized. A clear, transparent dispute process was documented and distributed to every household in Sycamore Creek Estates, in plain language, without lavender. The comparative citation data, Margaret's column F, 41 properties, 11 months, was formally entered into the governance record as the basis for the new equal enforcement policy. Sylvia Hartman still lives in Sycamore Creek Estates, third house on Birchwood Drive. She tends her garden on Saturday mornings and attends community events occasionally, and Margaret has nodded to her across parking lots and backyard fences with the specific, neutral civility of a woman who has nothing left to prove and nowhere left to be small. They have not spoken. They do not need to. There is a version of this story where Margaret confronts Sylvia directly, where she stands across a table and names every pale yellow envelope by number and watches Sylvia's composure finally, visibly break. I understand why that version is satisfying. I have wanted that version myself, in my own life, more than once. But Margaret did not want that version. She wanted her house back. She wanted to hang a wind chime on her own porch and park her car in her own driveway and exist in the space she had earned without cataloging every visible inch of herself against someone else's arbitrary standards. She got that. Completely. Permanently. And Sylvia Hartman got 11 votes. In the end, that was enough. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If any part of Margaret's story reminded you of something you've lived through, a place that was supposed to be safe, a person who decided before you arrived that you were a problem, I see you. You do not have to justify why it hurt. You do not have to explain why the small things added up. Some spaces are only safe for certain people, and that was never your fault. If this one found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. Tell me if you have a Sylvia in your life, past or present. I read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, well, you sat through 40 fines and a special community meeting. You know what we do here. Around here, we don't just survive it, we understand it. And then we let it go. I'll see you by the fire.